When the townsmen of Redemption Falls decided to pair their leftover blacksmith with an abandoned mail-order bride as a cruel joke, they never imagined James McKenna would treat Catherine Walsh like the treasure she truly was. But as her dangerous past catches up to them in the Wyoming Territory of 1867, will their unexpected love be strong enough to survive the reckoning that's coming? Fire danced in the forge like an angry spirit, sending sparks shooting into the morning air of Redemption Falls, Wyoming Territory. James McKenna grabbed the red-hot iron with his long tongs, muscles bulging as he brought his hammer down with a thunderous clang that echoed through the dusty streets. It was July 15, 1867, and the summer heat made his blacksmith shop feel like the inside of an oven. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he worked, shaping the glowing metal into a horseshoe. At 32 years old, James was considered an old bachelor in this frontier town where most men married by 25. His strong hands had built half the iron gates and door handles in Redemption Falls, but they had never held a woman's hand in marriage. The sound of his hammer kept perfect time, like a giant clock counting down the minutes of his lonely life. Strike, pause, strike, pause. Each blow sent vibrations up his arms and into his chest, where his heart beat with the same steady rhythm. He had grown used to the solitude, finding comfort in the honest work of bending metal to his will. Through the open doors of his shop, James could see the townspeople going about their morning business. Mrs. Henderson swept the front steps of her boarding house, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Two cowboys rode past on their way to the Broken Arrow Ranch, their spurs jingling like tiny bells. A group of children chased a spotted dog down Main Street, their laughter mixing with the sound of his hammer. James wiped his face with a dirty cloth and stepped outside for fresh air. The morning sun painted the wooden buildings golden yellow, and a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains stood like giant sleeping bears against the bright blue sky. "Morning, James," called out Doc Patterson as he walked by with his black medical bag. "Hot enough for you?" "Could be worse," James replied, though his shirt was already soaked through with sweat. "At least the iron heats up faster." The doctor chuckled and continued on his way to check on Mrs. Garcia's new baby. James watched him go, thinking about how different their lives were. Doc Patterson had a wife and 3 children, a house with white curtains in the windows, and people who needed him every day. James had his forge, his small room above the shop, and the respect that came from being the best blacksmith in 3 counties. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached town. James shaded his eyes with his hand and saw 3 riders coming fast. Even from a distance, he recognized the lead horse, a fancy black stallion that belonged to Silas Brennan, the cattle baron's son who thought he owned the whole territory. James felt his stomach tighten like a knot. Whenever Brennan showed up with his friends, trouble usually followed. The young man had never forgiven James for refusing to shoe his horses for free, claiming that successful businessmen should help each other out. James had politely explained that he needed to eat just like everyone else, which had made Brennan's face turn red as a tomato. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, drowning out the peaceful morning sounds. James could see Brennan's 2 companions now, Pete Wilson and Jake Murphy, both sons of wealthy ranchers who spent their days finding ways to amuse themselves at other people's expense. They rode their horses like they rode through life, fast and careless, leaving dust and damage in their wake. James picked up his hammer again, pretending to be busy with his work. Sometimes if he ignored them, they would ride past without stopping. But today felt different. There was something in the way they slowed their horses as they approached his shop, something in the way Brennan sat up straighter in his saddle, that told James this visit had a purpose. The 3 riders pulled up in front of the blacksmith shop, their horses snorting and stamping their feet. Brennan dismounted with a flourish, his expensive boots hitting the dirt with authority. His friends stayed on their horses, grinning like cats who had found a mouse to play with. "McKenna!" Brennan called out, his voice carrying across the street and making several people turn to look. "We need to have a conversation." James set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. Whatever Brennan wanted, it wouldn't be good news. The young man's smile was too wide, too pleased with itself. It was the kind of smile that meant someone was about to become the target of a joke they wouldn't find funny. "What can I do for you, Brennan?" James asked, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Oh, it's not what you can do for me," Brennan replied, walking closer with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no. "It's what I can do for you. You see, we've been talking, and we think it's time someone helped you with your situation." The word situation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. James knew exactly what Brennan meant, but he wasn't going to make this easy for him. "I'm not sure what situation you're talking about," James said. Brennan's grin grew even wider. "Your bachelor situation, of course. A man your age should have a wife, don't you think? Someone to cook his meals, mend his clothes, warm his bed on cold nights." The other two riders chuckled, and James felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the forge. This was exactly the kind of conversation he had been dreading, the kind that made him feel like a piece of broken furniture that people pitied. "I manage just fine on my own," James replied. "Oh, I'm sure you do," Brennan said, circling around James like a vulture. "But what if I told you that fate has provided a solution? What if I told you that there's a woman coming to town tomorrow who needs a husband just as much as you need a wife?" James felt his heart skip a beat, but he kept his face blank as a stone wall. In a frontier town like Redemption Falls, unmarried women were rarer than gold nuggets, and the few who did arrive usually had their pick of suitors. Whatever Brennan was planning, it couldn't be good news for either James or the mysterious woman. "There's a mail-order bride coming in on tomorrow's stage," Brennan continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Pretty little thing named Catherine Walsh, all the way from Boston. Red hair, green eyes, and a figure that would make a preacher forget his sermon." Pete Wilson laughed so hard he nearly fell off his horse. "Tell him the best part, Silas." Brennan held up his hand for silence, savoring the moment like a piece of candy. "The best part is that she was supposed to marry young Tom Fletcher. Had it all arranged through letters and everything. But yesterday, Tom decided he'd rather court the banker's daughter instead. Left Miss Walsh without a groom and the whole town talking." James felt a mixture of anger and pity wash over him. He had heard about mail-order brides, women desperate enough to travel hundreds of miles to marry complete strangers. The idea of someone being abandoned after making such a difficult journey made his chest tight with sympathy. "So we thought," Brennan continued, "why not solve two problems at once? Tom doesn't want his leftover bride, and you need a wife. Perfect match, wouldn't you say?" The word leftover hit James like a slap across the face. It was bad enough that they thought of him as someone who deserved scraps from other men's tables, but to describe an innocent woman the same way made his hands curl into fists. Jake Murphy leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes bright with cruel amusement. "Think about it, McKenna. When's the last time a woman like that even looked at you? This might be your only chance. Unless you're too proud to take another man's leavings," Pete added with a sneer. James could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him now. Word of Brennan's proposal was spreading like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations and meaningful glances. By evening, everyone in Redemption Falls would know that the leftover blacksmith was being offered the leftover bride. "What makes you think she'd want to marry me?" James asked quietly. Brennan shrugged. "What choice does she have? No money to get back to Boston, no family to take her in, and no other prospects in sight. You'd be doing her a favor, really, giving her a roof over her head and food on the table. More than most women in her position could hope for." The casual cruelty in Brennan's voice made James's jaw clench. This wasn't about helping anyone. This was about entertainment, about turning two people's loneliness into a joke for the amusement of bored rich boys. "Besides," Jake added, "it's not like you have any other options. At your age, with your circumstances, this might be the best offer you ever get." James looked at the three young men, seeing the way they sat their horses like kings surveying their kingdom. They had been born into wealth and privilege, handed everything they wanted without having to work for it. They had never known what it felt like to be judged and found wanting, to be treated like a consolation prize. "I'll think about it," James said finally. "Don't think too long," Brennan warned, remounting his horse. Word is already spreading about the available bride. Other men might start getting ideas. And then where would you be? The three riders spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving James standing in a cloud of dust and humiliation. He could feel the stares of his neighbors, could almost hear their thoughts. Poor James McKenna, so desperate for a wife he'll take another man's cast-off. He turned back to his forge, but the fire had died down to glowing coals. Just like his enthusiasm for the day, the heat had gone out of everything. He pumped the bellows mechanically, watching the coals brighten and spark back to life. As he worked, James thought about the woman on tomorrow's stage. Catherine Walsh from Boston, with red hair and green eyes and nowhere else to go. What kind of courage did it take to travel so far for marriage to a stranger? What kind of desperation drove a woman to such extremes? He tried to imagine her stepping off the dusty stagecoach, looking around at the rough buildings and rougher people of Redemption Falls. Would she be disappointed by what she found? Would she take one look at him and wish she had stayed in Boston? Poor but proud? The church bell tolled noon, its bronze voice carrying across the town like a warning. Tomorrow at this time, Catherine Walsh would be here, and James would have to decide whether to step forward and claim her or watch some other man solve his loneliness at her expense. He picked up his hammer again, but his rhythm was off now. The steady beat that had comforted him all morning was broken, replaced by uncertainty and something that might have been hope. For the first time in years, James McKenna didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for certain. If he did marry Catherine Walsh, it wouldn't be as the leftover man accepting the leftover bride. It would be as a man who understood what it meant to be unwanted, offering whatever protection and kindness he could to a woman in the same situation. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something real from the broken pieces of other people's plans. The stagecoach thundered into Redemption Falls like a rolling earthquake, its wheels kicking up a tornado of dust that made everyone on Main Street cover their faces and step back. James McKenna stood frozen among the crowd, his clean white shirt already damp with nervous sweat despite the cool morning air. He had spent the entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. The driver pulled hard on the reins, and the four horses came to a snorting, stamping halt in front of the general store. "Redemption Falls!" he shouted, climbing down from his high perch with creaking joints. "End of the line for some, beginning for others." James wiped his palms on his pants and tried to calm the butterflies dancing in his stomach. Around him, the townspeople pressed closer, their faces bright with curiosity. News of the leftover bride had spread faster than a prairie fire, and it seemed like everyone in town had found an excuse to be on Main Street this morning. Mrs. Henderson elbowed her way to the front of the crowd, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I wonder what she looks like," she whispered loudly to her friend Mrs. Garcia. "City girls can be awfully particular about things." The stagecoach door swung open with a rusty squeak, and James held his breath. A small gloved hand appeared first, followed by a worn brown boot that felt carefully for the ground. Then Catherine Walsh stepped into the morning sunlight, and James felt like someone had punched him in the chest. She was nothing like he had expected. Brennan had described a delicate flower, but the woman standing before the stagecoach looked like she could weather any storm. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with a few rebellious curls escaping around her face. Her traveling dress was plain brown wool, mended in several places but clean and pressed. But it was her eyes that captured James's attention, steel gray and alert, taking in everything around her with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust first impressions. Catherine Walsh was not beautiful in the way the saloon girls were beautiful, with their painted faces and fancy dresses. She was beautiful like a well-made tool, simple and strong and perfectly suited for the job ahead. James felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with pity or convenience. The driver hauled a battered trunk down from the top of the coach and set it on the ground with a thump. "Miss Catherine Walsh," he announced. "Safe and sound from Boston, Massachusetts." Catherine picked up her small carpetbag and looked around the crowd with those sharp gray eyes. James saw the exact moment when understanding dawned on her face. No young man stepped forward to claim her with joy and flowers. No one called her name with welcome. Instead, she faced a crowd of strangers studying her like she was a horse at auction. "Where is Mr. Fletcher?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent that spoke of childhood origins. The words were calm and controlled, but James could hear the edge of worry underneath. An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. People shuffled their feet and looked at each other, waiting for someone else to deliver the bad news. Finally, Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat and stepped forward. "I'm afraid there's been a change in plans, dear," she said with false sweetness. "Mr. Fletcher has decided to court someone else. But don't you worry. We found you another gentleman who's eager to make your acquaintance." James saw Catherine's hands tighten on her bag, her knuckles going white under her thin gloves. For just a moment, her careful composure cracked, and he glimpsed the fear and exhaustion underneath. She had traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, and now that stranger had abandoned her before they'd even met. "I see," Catherine said quietly. Her gaze swept the crowd again, and this time it stopped on James. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and something passed between them, not attraction exactly, but recognition. She saw a man who understood what it felt like to be unwanted, and he saw a woman who refused to let that break her. James stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The crowd parted to let him through, their whispers following him like buzzing flies. He stopped 3 feet away from Catherine and removed his hat, revealing hair that he had combed with extra care that morning. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "My name is James McKenna. I'm the blacksmith here in town." Catherine studied his face with those intelligent gray eyes, taking in his calloused hands and work-worn clothes. He was not the young romantic hero she might have dreamed of during her long journey west. He was a man who smelled of coal smoke and honest sweat, whose face was marked by years of hard work under the summer sun. "Mr. McKenna," she replied with a small nod. "I suppose you've heard about my situation." "I have," James admitted, "and I'd like to offer you a choice." The word choice seemed to surprise her. James could see her processing it, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit where she expected. "What kind of choice?" she asked. James was aware of the crowd hanging on every word, but he forced himself to focus only on Catherine. "You can marry me if you want," he said simply. "Not because you have to, but because you choose to. Or I can help you find another way, work, maybe, or passage back east if that's what you prefer." Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving noise. "The girl needs a husband, not charity," she said loudly. "The girl needs to make her own decision," James replied without taking his eyes off Catherine. "Whatever that might be." Catherine set down her carpetbag and smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt. Around them, the crowd waited with barely contained excitement, like spectators at a prize fight. James could feel their expectations pressing down on him like a heavy blanket, but he pushed them aside. This moment belonged to him and Catherine, not to the entertainment of bored townspeople. "You're offering to marry a complete stranger," Catherine said. "Why?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. James thought about all the reasons he could give: loneliness, practical necessity, the need for companionship in a hard land. But when he looked into her eyes, only one truth seemed to matter. "Because I think we understand each other," he said, "and because everyone deserves to be chosen, not just taken as a last resort." Catherine's expression softened, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she almost smiled. "That's either the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most foolish." "Maybe both," James admitted. The church bell began to toll the hour, its deep bronze voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Catherine picked up her bag again and took a step closer to James, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and see the small scar above her left eyebrow. "I'll need time to think," she said, "and we'll need to talk properly away from—" She gestured at the crowd of curious faces surrounding them. "Of course," James said, relief flooding through him like cool water. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. Mrs. Henderson runs a clean boarding house. You can stay there while you decide. As they walked toward the boarding house, James carrying Catherine's heavy trunk as easily as if it were filled with feathers, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn down an unexpected road. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, their voices buzzing with speculation and gossip that would fuel conversations for weeks to come. Evening shadows stretched across the boarding house parlor like reaching fingers, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Catherine Walsh sat in the stiff-backed chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the dusty street outside. She had changed from her traveling dress into a simple blue cotton gown, and James noticed how the color brought out the storm cloud gray of her eyes. Mrs. Henderson hovered nearby, pretending to dust furniture that was already spotless while clearly hoping to overhear their conversation. James cleared his throat pointedly, and the older woman huffed with disappointment before retreating to the kitchen with obvious reluctance. "She means well," Catherine said with the hint of a smile, the first real warmth James had seen from her all day. "She means to know everyone's business," James replied, settling into the chair across from her. "But her heart's in the right place, even if her ears are always in the wrong place." Catherine laughed, a soft, musical sound that made something tight in James's chest loosen. "You have a way with words, Mr. McKenna. Not what I expected from a blacksmith." "People see the muscles and the soot and think there's nothing else," James said. "But iron doesn't shape itself. You have to understand it, know how it wants to bend and when it might break." "Like people," Catherine observed. "Exactly like people." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sounds of evening settling over Redemption Falls. Somewhere a dog barked, and from the saloon came the distant sound of piano music and laughter. A gentle breeze stirred the lace curtains, carrying the scent of prairie grass and wood smoke. "Tell me about yourself," James said. "Not the facts from your letters to Fletcher, but the real things. What you like, what you fear, what makes you laugh." Catherine's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "That's a dangerous question, Mr. McKenna. You might not like what you hear. Try me." She studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether he could handle the truth. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "I like books more than most people," she said. "I can read Shakespeare and Dickens, but I also know how to birth a calf and mend a roof. My mother died when I was 12, and I raised my 3 younger brothers while my father worked the docks in Boston. When he died 2 years ago, my oldest brother inherited everything and decided I was more burden than blessing." James felt anger kindle in his chest at the casual cruelty of family turning against their own, but he kept his expression neutral. Catherine needed to tell her story without interruption. "Patrick, that's my brother, he had debts," she continued. "Gambling debts to men who don't accept excuses for payment. He thought marrying me off would solve 2 problems. Get me out of his house and put some money in his pocket for my dowry." "So you came west to escape him," James said. "I came west because the alternative was worse," Catherine corrected. "Patrick had arranged for me to marry a man in Boston, a widower with 6 children who needed a housekeeper more than a wife. I'd seen how he treated his first wife before she died. She was covered in bruises more often than not." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with pain and fear. James felt his hands curl into fists, thinking about men who used their strength to hurt instead of protect. "When I heard about mail-order marriages, it seemed like salvation," Catherine said. "A chance to start over somewhere far from Patrick's reach, with a man who at least wanted a wife instead of a servant." "And then Fletcher changed his mind," James said gently. Catherine nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When I stepped off that stagecoach and saw the crowd staring at me like I was some kind of curiosity, I realized how foolish I'd been. I'd traded one form of dependence for another, and now I'm stranded 1,000 miles from everything I know." James leaned forward in his chair, his voice earnest. "You're not stranded, Catherine. You have choices now, maybe for the first time in your life." "Do I?" she asked. "I have $17 to my name and no skills that would earn me a living wage in a place like this. The only choices I see are marry you or starve." Then let me give you another choice, James said, standing up and walking to the window. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Stay here as my friend, not my wife. I'll help you find work, maybe with Doc Patterson's wife or at the school. You can pay me back when you're able, or not at all if you prefer. Catherine stared at him in amazement. You would do that? Help a stranger with no promise of anything in return. James turned back to face her, his expression serious. I know what it feels like to be alone, Catherine. I know what it's like to have people look at you and see only what you can't provide instead of what you can. If I can spare you that feeling, then yes, I'll do it gladly. For a moment, Catherine's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed her hands to her face as if trying to hold herself together. I'm sorry, she whispered. It's just, no one has ever offered me kindness without expecting something in return. James crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, offering her his clean handkerchief. You don't have to apologize for being human, Catherine, and you don't have to decide anything tonight. Sleep on it and we'll talk again tomorrow. Catherine took the handkerchief and wiped her eyes, leaving small smudges of road dust on the white cloth. What if I said yes to marrying you? Not because I have to, but because I want to try building something with someone who understands what it means to start over. James felt his heart skip a beat, but he forced himself to think carefully before answering. I'd say that marriage should be a partnership between equals, not a rescue mission. I'd want to know that you chose me, not just the safety I represent. And if I did choose you? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Then I'd spend every day proving worthy of that choice, James replied without hesitation. They looked at each other in the lamplight, two people who had been shaped by disappointment and rejection, but had somehow maintained the courage to hope for something better. Outside, the night sounds of Redemption Falls settled around them like a blanket, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of wooden buildings cooling in the evening air, the soft whisper of wind through the grass. I need to tell you something else, Catherine said suddenly, about why I really left Boston. James waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would be the key to understanding who Catherine Walsh really was. My brother Patrick didn't just have gambling debts, she said. He owed money to a man named Seamus Murphy, someone you don't want to disappoint. When Patrick couldn't pay, Murphy decided to take payment in other ways. He said I could work off the debt in his saloon, doing whatever he required. The implications of her words hit James like a physical blow. He had heard stories about such men, predators who used debt as a weapon to trap innocent women in lives of degradation and abuse. I ran that very night, Catherine continued, packed what I could carry and used my mother's jewelry to buy passage west. But men like Murphy don't forget, and they don't forgive. I'm afraid that someday he might come looking for me, and I don't want to bring that danger into anyone else's life. James reached out and gently took her hands in his, feeling the calluses on her palms that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Catherine, if you marry me, you won't be bringing danger into my life. You'll be sharing whatever comes with someone who's willing to face it beside you. She looked down at their joined hands, hers small and pale against his larger, darker ones. You say that now, but you don't know what these men are capable of. And you don't know what I'm capable of when it comes to protecting someone I care about, James replied firmly. I may just be a blacksmith, but I didn't survive on the frontier by being weak or foolish. Catherine raised her eyes to meet his, and James saw something shift in their gray depths. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished no matter how hard life tried to snuff it out. Ask me again tomorrow, she said softly. Ask me to marry you when the sun is shining and I can think clearly about the future instead of running from the past. James squeezed her hands gently before releasing them. I'll ask you every day until you give me an answer you're comfortable with. Yes or no, whatever feels right to you. As he stood to leave, Catherine called his name softly. James? Thank you. For the first time in years, I feel like someone sees me as more than a problem to be solved. Walking back to his small room above the blacksmith shop, James looked up at the star-filled sky and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope for a future that might be better than his past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in years, he wasn't facing them alone. Lightning split the morning sky like a giant's axe, followed by thunder that shook the windows of every building in Redemption Falls. James McKenna stood in his doorway watching the storm roll in from the mountains, dark clouds heavy with rain and the promise of change. He had been awake since before dawn, his mind racing with thoughts of Catherine and the decision she would make today. The first fat raindrops began to fall, each one hitting the dusty street with a small puff of dirt. Within minutes, the gentle drops became a downpour that sent people running for cover and turned Main Street into a river of mud. James pulled on his rain slicker and headed for the boarding house, his boots splashing through puddles that hadn't existed moments before. Mrs. Henderson met him at the door, her face grim with worry. "She's been up all night," she whispered, glancing toward the stairs, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Whatever decision she's wrestling with, it's tearing her apart." James climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with each step. He found Catherine standing at the window of her small room, still wearing yesterday's blue dress, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked fragile in the gray morning light, like a flower that had been battered by too many storms. "Catherine," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned at the sound of his voice, and James saw that her eyes were red from crying. "I can't do it, James," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't marry you or anyone else. I'm too scared, too damaged. You deserve better than someone who jumps at shadows and can't trust her own heart." James stepped into the room, rain dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. "What happened? Yesterday you seemed ready to consider a future together." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself as if she was cold, despite the warmth of the room. "I had a dream last night, about Murphy and what he would do if he found me. I saw him hurting you because of me, and I realized I can't put you in that kind of danger." "Dreams aren't real, Catherine," James said gently, but she shook her head. "This one felt real. More real than anything I've felt since I got here." She moved away from the window, putting distance between them. "I've made up my mind. I'm going to take the next stage out of town. Maybe to California, or somewhere else far away where I can disappear completely." The words hit James like a physical blow. He had expected many things from this conversation, but not this sudden retreat into fear and isolation. "Running away won't solve anything," he said. "You'll just be alone and afraid in a different place." "Better alone than responsible for someone else getting hurt," Catherine replied, but James could hear the doubt in her voice. Before he could respond, the sound of horses' hooves echoed through the rain-soaked street below. James looked out the window and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 riders were approaching the boarding house, their horses steaming in the cold rain. Even through the storm, he could see that these were not local men. Their clothes were too fine, their horses too well-bred for frontier life. "Catherine," he said urgently, "come look at this." She joined him at the window, and James felt her body go rigid beside him. The lead rider was a tall man with dark hair and expensive clothes, his face bearing a strong resemblance to Catherine's own features. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, and when he looked up at the boarding house, his smile was cold as winter frost. "It's him," Catherine whispered, her face going white as fresh snow. "It's Murphy. He found me." James felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. This man had terrorized Catherine, had driven her to flee across a continent in search of safety. Now he had followed her here, bringing his threats and violence to the peaceful town of Redemption Falls. "How did he find you so quickly?" James asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "Patrick must have told him about the mail-order marriage," Catherine said, her voice barely audible. "He probably figured I'd come west to escape. It wouldn't be hard to track down a Boston woman traveling alone." Downstairs, they could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice raised in argument, followed by the heavy tread of boots on the stairs. "Murphy wasn't waiting for an invitation. He was coming up whether they wanted him to or not. Catherine, James said urgently, listen to me. You don't have to face this alone. If you marry me right now, today, you'll have legal protection. He can't force a married woman to leave her husband. Catherine stared at him in amazement. You want to marry me to protect me from Murphy? That's not fair to you, James. That's not the kind of marriage either of us wants. It's the kind of marriage that keeps you safe, James replied firmly. We can worry about the rest later. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. James could hear Murphy's voice now, smooth and confident, telling Mrs. Henderson that he was here to collect his property. The word made James's hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. There's no time to think about this, James said. Catherine, do you trust me? She looked into his eyes, and James saw the exact moment when she made her decision. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something stronger, determination. I trust you, she said simply. James took her hand and led her to the small desk in the corner of the room. He grabbed a piece of paper and began writing quickly, his handwriting bold and clear despite his haste. This is a marriage contract, he explained as he wrote. In the eyes of the law, it's as binding as any church ceremony. All we need is witnesses. The door to Catherine's room burst open without warning, and Murphy stepped inside like he owned the place. He was even more imposing up close, tall and broad-shouldered with cold blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Behind him stood two other men, clearly hired muscle with scarred knuckles and weapons at their sides. Hello, Catherine, Murphy said, his Irish accent thick with false warmth. You've led me quite a chase, but the game is over now. Time to come home and pay your brother's debts. This is my home now, Catherine said, stepping closer to James. And I don't owe you anything. Murphy's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, but you do, sweetheart. Your brother's debt passed to you when he died last month. Convenient timing. Really one less mouth to feed and one more way to collect what's owed. James felt Catherine's hand tighten in his, but she kept her voice steady. Patrick is dead? Fell down some stairs, Murphy said with a shrug that suggested the fall might not have been accidental. Tragic accident. But business is business, and debts don't die with the debtor. James stepped forward, placing himself between Murphy and Catherine. The lady is under my protection now, he said, his voice carrying the strength of hammered steel. She's not going anywhere with you. Murphy's eyes narrowed as he took in James's work-worn clothes and calloused hands. And who might you be? Blacksmith? Her husband, James said, holding up the contract he had just signed. As of this morning, Catherine Walsh is Catherine McKenna. She's my wife and she's staying right here. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Murphy's face went through several expressions. Surprise, anger, and finally cold calculation. That's impossible, he said finally. She's been here less than 2 days. No one gets married that quickly. People do when they're in love, James replied, his arm moving protectively around Catherine's waist. And when they find the right person, they don't waste time with long engagements. Murphy's smile returned, but it held no warmth. Love, is it? Well, isn't that romantic? But I'm afraid it doesn't change anything. The debt is still there, and one way or another, it will be paid. The rain hammered against the boarding house windows like bullets, each drop exploding into tiny fragments that caught the gray morning light. Catherine McKenna, she was already thinking of herself with her new name, stood beside James as Murphy circled them like a wolf studying its prey. His two companions blocked the doorway, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. You see, blacksmith, Murphy said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. Catherine's brother owed me $5,000. That's more money than most people in this godforsaken town see in a lifetime. Marriage doesn't erase debt. It just transfers it to the husband. James felt his stomach drop. $5,000 was indeed a fortune, more than he could earn in several years of honest work. But he kept his face blank, not wanting to give Murphy the satisfaction of seeing his shock. I don't know anything about any debt, James said carefully. And I don't know anything about you. All I know is that you're frightening my wife, and I'm asking you to leave." Murphy's laugh echoed through the small room like the sound of breaking bones. "Asking me to leave? Oh, that's rich. Do you know who I am, country boy? I own half of Boston's docks and control more business than you can imagine. I don't get asked to do anything. I give the orders." Catherine stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear James could see in her eyes. "You don't own me, Murphy. You never did. Patrick's debts were his own, and they died with him. Did they now?" Murphy reached into his expensive coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This here is a legal document, signed by your dear departed brother. It says that if he couldn't pay his debts, his sister would work them off in my establishment. Very specific terms, all perfectly legal." James snatched the paper from Murphy's hand and read it quickly, his heart sinking with each word. The document was real, written in Patrick's handwriting and signed with his name. It was also the most evil thing James had ever seen. A contract that essentially sold Catherine into slavery to pay for her brother's gambling. "This isn't worth the paper it's written on," James said, tearing the document in half. "No court in America would enforce a contract like this." Murphy's smile widened. "Maybe not in America, but Catherine isn't American, is she? She's Irish, like me. And Irish law is very different when it comes to family debts. I have friends in high places who would be happy to help me collect what's owed." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. James looked at the torn pieces of paper in his hands and realized that Murphy's power came not from the law but from the fear he inspired. Men like him had thrived for centuries by convincing people that resistance was useless. "Besides," Murphy continued, "I'm not unreasonable. I'm willing to make a deal. Catherine can come work for me for 1 year, just 1 year, and the debt will be considered paid. She'll be treated well, fed regularly, given a place to sleep. Better than most women in her position could hope for." "What kind of work?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Murphy's grin was predatory. "The kind that pays well and doesn't require much education. She's a pretty girl, and my customers appreciate beauty. She'll earn her keep and then some." Catherine made a sound like a wounded animal, and James felt rage bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. The casual way Murphy discussed selling Catherine's dignity and freedom made his vision blur red around the edges. "Get out," James said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out of my town and don't come back." "Your town?" Murphy laughed. "What are you going to do, blacksmith? Fight me? You're outnumbered 3-1, and my boys here are professionals. They've handled bigger men than you." James looked at the 2 gunmen flanking the door, taking in their stance and the way they wore their weapons. They were professionals, no doubt about it, but they were also overconfident. Men who relied on fear and intimidation often forgot that sometimes desperate people fought back. "I'm not going to fight you," James said, moving slowly toward his coat hanging on the chair. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can leave now, today, and never bother my wife again. Or you can stay and face the consequences." "What consequences?" Murphy scoffed. "You're a nobody in a nothing town. You have no power here." James pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. "This is a telegraph I sent to the territorial marshal yesterday, describing your visit and your intentions. By now, Marshal Thompson knows exactly who you are and why you're here. He's probably already on his way." Murphy's expression changed, the confidence flickering for just a moment. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" James walked to the window and pointed outside. "See that rider coming down Main Street? That's Deputy Harrison, and he's headed straight for this building. Behind him, I count at least 6 other men, all armed and all very interested in meeting you." Catherine looked out the window and gasped. A group of riders was indeed approaching the boarding house, their horses splashing through the muddy street. At their head rode a man wearing a star-shaped badge, his face grim with purpose. Murphy cursed under his breath and moved to the window, his composure cracking. "How did you know to contact the marshal?" "Because I'm not as stupid as you think," James replied. "I've lived on the frontier long enough to know that men like you don't travel alone unless they're planning something illegal. I also know that territorial marshals don't like outside criminals operating in their jurisdiction. The sound of boots on the stairs echoed through the building again, but this time it was the heavy, measured tread of lawmen. James heard Mrs. Henderson's voice raised in relief, followed by the authoritative tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Murphy!" a voice called from the hallway. "This is Marshal Thompson. I want to talk to you about some outstanding warrants from back east." Murphy's face went white as fresh snow. Whatever power he had in Boston clearly didn't extend to the Wyoming Territory, and the mention of warrants suggested that his business dealings had finally caught up with him. "This isn't over," Murphy snarled, turning back to Catherine. "You can't hide behind the law forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to pay what you owe." "She doesn't owe you anything," James said firmly. "And neither do I. Her brother's debts were his own responsibility, not hers." The door burst open, and Marshal Thompson entered with 3 deputies, their weapons drawn and ready. Thompson was a tall, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. He took in the scene with a single glance and focused on Murphy. "Seamus Murphy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're under arrest for extortion, human trafficking, and violation of the Mann Act. You have the right to remain silent." Murphy's 2 companions reached for their guns, but they were too slow. The deputies had them disarmed and on the floor before they could clear leather. Murphy himself stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You have no jurisdiction over me," Murphy protested. "I'm a legitimate businessman." "Maybe in Boston," Thompson replied, snapping handcuffs on Murphy's wrists. "But here in Wyoming, we take a dim view of men who threaten women and try to enforce illegal contracts. You should have stayed in Massachusetts." As the lawman led Murphy and his men away, James felt Catherine collapse against him, her body shaking with relief and delayed shock. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "He can't hurt you anymore." Catherine pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears. "How did you know to contact the marshal? When did you send that telegraph?" James smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I didn't. I was bluffing. But sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to call their bluff with a bigger one." Catherine stared at him in amazement, then began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle but grew into full-bodied laughter that shook her entire frame. James found himself laughing too, the tension of the morning finally releasing its grip on them both. "You magnificent, wonderful man," Catherine said, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. "You saved my life with nothing but quick thinking and a good bluff." "We saved each other," James corrected, pulling her close again. "And now we have the rest of our lives to figure out what comes next." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, painting the wet street in shades of gold and hope. The wedding bells of Redemption Falls rang out across the valley like music from heaven itself, their bronze voices carrying news of joy to every corner of the territory. Catherine McKenna stood before the mirror in Mrs. Henderson's best room, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Gone was the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the stagecoach just 1 week ago. In her place stood a woman who had found her courage and chosen her own destiny. The wedding dress had been a surprise from the women of the town. When word spread that Catherine and James would have a proper ceremony now that the danger had passed, the ladies had gathered their finest materials. Mrs. Garcia contributed ivory silk from her own wedding dress. Mrs. Patterson added delicate lace from her grandmother's collection, and even the saloon girls had pooled their money to buy seed pearls for decoration. "You look like an angel," whispered young Annie Fletcher, Tom's little sister, who had insisted on helping Catherine get ready. The 10-year-old had taken it upon herself to make amends for her brother's shameful behavior, bringing wildflowers and ribbons every day since Murphy's arrest. Catherine smoothed the silk skirt and adjusted the simple pearl necklace that had been her mother's. "I feel like I'm in a dream, Annie. A wonderful dream that I'm afraid I might wake up from." "It's not a dream," Annie said solemnly. "My pa says when 2 people love each other the way you and Mr. McKenna do, It's the realest thing in the world. Love. The word still felt strange on Catherine's tongue, but she couldn't deny the truth of it anymore. What had started as a marriage of convenience had grown into something deeper over the past week. James had courted her properly, bringing her flowers from the meadow, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings, sharing stories of his childhood and listening to hers. He had never pressured her for more than friendship, but Catherine had seen the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, like she was something precious and rare. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Catherine?" came James's voice, thick with nervousness. "The Reverend is ready, and half the town is waiting outside the church. You can't see the bride before the ceremony." Annie scolded through the door. "It's bad luck." James's laugh carried through the wooden panels. "Then I'll close my eyes and trust you to guide her to the altar. But hurry. I'm about to jump out of my skin with worry that she'll change her mind." Catherine felt her heart flutter at the vulnerability in his voice. This strong, capable man was nervous about marrying her, as if she were the prize instead of the consolation. She picked up her bouquet of prairie roses and took a deep breath. "I'm ready," she called out, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The walk to the church felt like floating on air. The entire population of Redemption Falls seemed to have turned out for the wedding, lining the dusty street with smiles and cheers. Children threw flower petals in Catherine's path, while their mothers dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the cowboys from the surrounding ranches had ridden in to witness the union of the blacksmith and his bride. But it was James waiting at the altar who took Catherine's breath away. He wore his best black suit, newly pressed and cleaned, with a white shirt that made his tanned skin glow. His hair was combed back with pomade, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. But it was his expression that made Catherine's knees weak. Pure joy mixed with disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Reverend Morrison opened his worn Bible and smiled at the couple before him. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James McKenna and Catherine Walsh in holy matrimony. This is a joyous occasion, made all the more special by the courage these two have shown in choosing love over fear, hope over despair." As the ceremony proceeded, Catherine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been trapped in Boston with no options and a brother who saw her as nothing more than a burden. Today, she stood before God and the community as an equal partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. "James," Reverend Morrison said, "do you take Catherine to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" James's voice rang out clear and strong. "I do, with all my heart and soul." "Catherine, do you take James to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Catherine looked into James's eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not perfect, but real and honest and full of possibility. "I do," she said, her voice carrying across the packed church. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and sweet, a promise of the life they would build together. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors, the church erupted in cheers and applause. Rice flew through the air like blessing, and the church bells began their joyous song once again. But as they walked down the aisle as husband and wife, Catherine noticed a familiar figure in the back of the church. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the man who had been Murphy's second in command, the one who had escaped when the marshal arrested his boss. He was watching her with cold, calculating eyes, and when their gazes met, he touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute before slipping out the back door. Catherine squeezed James's arm, trying not to let her fear show on her face. Murphy might be in jail, but his reach was longer than they had realized. The danger wasn't over. It had simply taken a different form. As they emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight, Catherine forced herself to smile and accept the congratulations of their well-wishers. But her mind was racing, trying to figure out how to tell James that their troubles were far from over. She had hoped that marriage would be the end of her running, but it seemed like it might just be the beginning of a different kind of fight. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a wedding feast in the boarding house dining room, and the celebration continued with music and dancing late into the evening. Catherine played the part of the happy bride, but her eyes kept scanning the crowd for any sign of danger. When James finally noticed her distraction, he pulled her aside. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "You've been jumpy all evening." Catherine glanced around to make sure they couldn't be overheard. One of Murphy's men was at the church, the tall one with the scar on his cheek. "He was watching us, James." "Watching me?" James's expression hardened. "Are you sure?" "Positive." He looked right at me and smiled, like he was making a promise. "Murphy might be in jail, but he still has people on the outside." James was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed this information. "Then we'll be ready for them," he said finally. "We'll be careful, we'll be smart, and we'll protect what we've built together." Catherine felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had chosen well when she chose James McKenna, not just as a husband, but as a partner who would stand beside her against whatever storms might come. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift home, Catherine and James walked hand in hand to their new house behind the church. It was small but clean, with a kitchen garden already planted and curtains that Mrs. Garcia had sewn as a wedding gift. It felt like home in a way that nowhere else ever had. "Mrs. McKenna," James said, testing out her new name with a smile that made her heart skip. "Mr. McKenna," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him properly for the first time as his wife. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for tonight, that was enough. 6 weeks of married life had settled over Catherine and James like a comfortable quilt, warm and secure despite the changing season. October had painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the morning air carried the sharp promise of winter. Catherine hummed as she kneaded bread dough in their small kitchen, her hands working the rhythm that her mother had taught her years ago in Boston. Through the window, she could see James in his forge, his hammer ringing against red-hot iron as he shaped horseshoes for the Miller Ranch. The sound had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, a steady percussion that marked the hours of their days together. She had learned to read his moods in the tempo of his work, quick and sharp when he was worried, slow and deliberate when he was thinking, musical and flowing when he was content. The bell above the front door of their house chimed, and Catherine wiped flour from her hands before going to see who had come calling. She found young Tommy Patterson on her doorstep, the doctor's 8-year-old son with his cap askew and his face flushed from running. "Mrs. McKenna," he gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Ma says to come quick. Mrs. Wilson is having her baby, and something's wrong. Pa needs help, and Ma said you know about birthing babies." Catherine's blood ran cold. She had indeed helped deliver babies back in Boston, learning the skill from her mother who had served as a midwife for their neighborhood. But that had been years ago, and she had hoped never to face such responsibility again after the terrible night when both mother and child had died despite her best efforts. "Where is your father now?" she asked, already reaching for her shawl and the small bag of medical supplies she kept for emergencies. "At the Wilson place, but he sent word that the baby is turned wrong and Mrs. Wilson is getting weaker. He needs someone who knows women's bodies, not just book learning." Catherine's hands shook as she tied her shawl. Mary Wilson was only 19, married just over a year to a sweet boy who worked at the grain mill. She was small-boned and delicate, not built for difficult births. If the baby was indeed turned wrong, both mother and child could die without skilled intervention. James appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion from his forge. "What's happening?" he asked, taking in Catherine's pale face and Tommy's urgent manner. "Mary Wilson is in trouble with her baby," Catherine explained quickly. "Doc Patterson needs help, and apparently I'm the closest thing to a midwife in town." James's expression grew serious. He knew about Catherine's experience with childbirth, and he also knew about the tragedy that had made her reluctant to ever assist again. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked gently. Catherine looked at Tommy's worried face and thought about Mary Wilson, probably scared and in pain, with her young husband pacing the floor in helpless terror. "I don't want to," she admitted. But I have to. She needs help, and I'm the only one who can give it. James kissed her forehead quickly. Then go, he said. I'll pray for all of you. The ride to the Wilson homestead seemed to take forever, even though it was only 2 miles outside of town. Catherine sat behind Tommy on his pony, her medical bag clutched tight against her chest, and her mind racing through everything she remembered about difficult births. Most problems could be solved with patience and gentle manipulation, but some required decisions that could haunt a person forever. The Wilson house was small but neat, with a garden that showed Mary's careful tending. Inside, Catherine could hear sounds that made her stomach clench, low moans of pain punctuated by worried voices. She had hoped never to hear those sounds again. But here she was, walking into another woman's crisis with nothing but old knowledge and shaking hands. Doc Patterson met her at the door, his usually calm face creased with worry. Thank God you're here, Catherine. I've done what I can. But the baby is breech and Mary is exhausted. She's been in labor for 18 hours, and I'm afraid she doesn't have much strength left. Catherine set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. Let me see her. Mary Wilson lay in the bedroom, her face pale as milk and damp with sweat. Her husband Robert sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering encouragement that she was too tired to hear. When Mary saw Catherine, her eyes filled with tears of relief. Please, she whispered, please help my baby. Catherine examined Mary quickly, her hands gentle but thorough. The situation was indeed serious. The baby was turned completely around, presenting feet first instead of head first. Worse, the umbilical cord seemed to be wrapped around the baby's body, which could cut off its air supply during delivery. Robert, Catherine said quietly, I need you to go boil some water and find me the cleanest towels you have. Doc Patterson, can you help me turn her to her side? As they worked together, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of terror and determination that had marked her midwife days in Boston. Every birth was a battle between life and death, with no guarantees and no second chances. But she had brought 17 babies safely into the world, and she was determined to make Mary's child the 18th. Mary, she said, taking the young woman's hand, I'm going to help your baby turn around, but it's going to hurt. You need to be brave for just a little longer. Mary nodded weakly. Do whatever you have to do. Just save my baby. What followed was the longest hour of Catherine's life. Working by instinct and memory, she carefully maneuvered the baby inside Mary's body, trying to untangle the cord and position the child for a safe delivery. Mary's cries of pain tore at Catherine's heart, but she forced herself to stay calm and focused. I can feel the head now, she announced finally. The baby's in the right position. Mary, on the next pain, I need you to push with everything you have left. The final moments of birth were always chaotic, but this time everything went perfectly. The baby slipped into Catherine's waiting hands, small and purple but breathing. As she cleared the tiny airways and stimulated the baby to cry, Catherine felt the familiar miracle of new life asserting itself against all odds. It's a girl, she announced, wrapping the baby in a clean towel before placing her on Mary's chest. A beautiful, perfect little girl. Mary's tears flowed freely as she looked at her daughter for the first time. Robert leaned over both of them, his own eyes wet with joy and relief. Thank you, he whispered to Catherine. Thank you for saving them both. Doc Patterson clapped Catherine on the shoulder. Outstanding work, he said. I couldn't have done better myself. Maybe it's time this town had 2 doctors. Catherine felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but she was too exhausted to fully appreciate it. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was fading, leaving her shaky and emotional. She had forgotten how intense these moments could be, how close life and death danced around each other in the birthing room. As she cleaned up and packed her supplies, Catherine thought about the irony of her situation. She had come west to escape her past, but her past had just saved 2 lives. The skills she had learned in Boston's tenements had proven valuable in Wyoming's frontier, connecting her old life to her new one in ways she never expected. The ride back to town was peaceful, with Tommy chattering excitedly about the baby he had glimpsed before being shooed outside. Catherine barely heard him, lost in her own thoughts about the day's events. She had faced her fears and emerged victorious, proving to herself that she was stronger than she had believed. James was waiting in their kitchen when she returned, a hot meal ready and concern written across his face. "How did it go?" he asked, searching her expression for clues. "Mother and baby are both fine," Catherine said, sinking into her chair with a sigh of relief. "A little girl, healthy and strong." James smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I know how hard that must have been." As they ate dinner together, Catherine told him about the delivery and Doc Patterson's suggestion that she consider becoming a doctor herself. "It's impossible, of course," she said. "Women can't become doctors, especially not out here." "Says who?" James asked. "If you can do the work, why shouldn't you be recognized for it? This territory needs all the medical help it can get." Catherine looked at her husband with new appreciation. Another man might have been threatened by his wife's skills or worried about her taking on dangerous work, but James saw her abilities as gifts to be used, not talents to be hidden. As they prepared for bed, Catherine reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had gone from being a burden to her family to being a valued member of her community. She had found not just a husband but a true partner who encouraged her to be the best version of herself. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities and challenges. But whatever came next, Catherine knew she could face it with confidence. She had chosen her path, chosen her partner, and chosen to use her gifts in service of others. That was more than many people could say, and it was enough to build a life on. Blood dripped from Catherine's split lip onto the white apron she wore for her medical work, each red drop marking the seconds since the nightmare had begun. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the old mine shaft, her heart pounding so loud she was sure her captors could hear it echoing through the tunnels. Murphy's man Donovan. She had learned his name, had taken her, while she was returning from delivering the Peterson baby, and now she was trapped in the abandoned silver mine 5 miles outside Redemption Falls. "You can't hide forever, Mrs. McKenna," Donovan's voice called through the darkness, his Irish accent thick with malice. "Boss Murphy wants to see you, and what the boss wants, the boss gets. Even from his jail cell." Catherine clutched the small medical knife she had managed to grab from her bag before Donovan had thrown it aside. The blade was barely 3 inches long, meant for cutting umbilical cords, not defending against armed men. But it was all she had, and she would use it if necessary to protect herself and the new life growing inside her. The pregnancy was barely 6 weeks along, so new that she hadn't even told James yet. She had planned to surprise him tonight with the news, maybe over dinner with his favorite apple pie. Instead, she was fighting for her life in a place where screams would never be heard. Footsteps echoed through the mine shaft, slow and deliberate. Donovan was in no hurry. He knew she had nowhere to run. The main entrance was blocked by his partner, a silent brute named Kelly who hadn't spoken a word since they grabbed her. The mine had other tunnels, but Catherine didn't know which ones led out and which ones led deeper into the mountain's belly. "You know, your husband thinks he's real clever," Donovan continued, his voice getting closer. "Thinks he outsmarted Murphy by getting you married legal-like. But Murphy's been planning this for months, ever since he got word you'd run west. Marriage doesn't protect you from everything, sweetheart." Catherine edged deeper into the tunnel, her hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. The darkness was complete here, broken only by the faint glow of Donovan's lantern far behind her. Her medical training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was different from delivering babies or setting bones. This was pure survival. "He's got friends in high places, Murphy does." Donovan's voice echoed strangely in the confined space. "Judges who owe him favors, marshals who look the other way for the right price. Your territorial marshal might have arrested him, but that just means he has to work through intermediaries now." The tunnel branched ahead of Catherine, splitting into 2 passages that disappeared into black emptiness. She had to choose and choose quickly. Behind her, the light from Donovan's lantern was getting brighter, which meant he was gaining ground. She chose the left passage, praying it would lead somewhere useful. The air smelled different here, mustier and older, with undertones of something else. Would smoke? Her heart leaped with hope. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. The thing is, Donovan continued, seemingly unaware that she had changed direction, Murphy doesn't just want his money anymore. Oh no, that debt has grown considerably. Interest, you understand. Inconvenience charges. Pain and suffering for the trouble you've caused him. Catherine pressed forward, following the faint scent of smoke through the winding tunnel. Her dress caught on rough stones, tearing in several places, but she didn't care about modesty now. Behind her, she could hear Donovan cursing as he realized she was no longer in the main passage. The tunnel opened suddenly into a wider chamber, and Catherine nearly sobbed with relief. Dim light filtered down from above, and she could see the remains of an old campfire in the center of the space. Someone had been here recently, prospectors, maybe, or cowboys taking shelter from a storm. More importantly, she could see another opening on the far side of the chamber, this one with fresh air flowing through it. An exit. Freedom. The chance to see James again and tell him about the baby. There you are. Donovan's voice came from directly behind her, and Catherine spun around to see his lantern illuminating the chamber entrance. End of the line, Mrs. McKenna. Time to come along quietly. Catherine raised the small medical knife, her hand trembling but determined. Stay back. I'm warning you. Donovan laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the confined space. You're going to fight me with that little pig sticker? That's adorable. But I've got news for you. I don't have time for games. He set down his lantern and pulled out a gun, its metal surface gleaming in the flickering light. Catherine's blood turned to ice water. She had hoped to keep this from becoming violent, but Donovan clearly had other plans. Murphy wants you alive, he said, advancing slowly. But he didn't say you had to be unmarked. Maybe a few bruises will remind you not to run away again. Catherine backed toward the far opening, calculating distances and chances. She was smaller and faster than Donovan, but he had longer legs and the advantage of knowing these tunnels. If she could reach the exit before he caught her, she might have a chance to outrun him in the open. You know what the funny thing is? Donovan continued, enjoying himself now. Your husband probably doesn't even know you're missing yet. Men like him, honest working men, they trust the world to be fair. They don't understand that predators like Murphy make their own rules. The words hit Catherine like physical blows, not because they were cruel but because they might be true. James was at his forge, probably wondering why she was late for dinner. It might be hours before he started to worry, and by then she could be halfway back to Boston, trapped in Murphy's web forever. But I'll tell you what, Donovan said, stopping just out of reach of her knife. You come along nice and quiet, and I'll make sure Murphy knows you cooperated. Might earn you better treatment once you start working off that debt. Catherine thought about the baby growing inside her. No bigger than a bean but already precious beyond measure. She thought about James waiting at home, the life they were building together, the future they had planned. She thought about Mary Wilson's healthy daughter and all the other babies she might help bring into the world. No, she said quietly, then louder. No, I won't go with you. I won't let Murphy destroy my life or my family. Donovan's expression hardened. Then you've made your choice. Don't blame me for what happens next. He lunged forward, reaching for her with his free hand while keeping the gun trained on her chest. Catherine reacted on pure instinct, slashing with the medical knife and catching him across the wrist. Donovan howled with pain and rage, his grip on the gun loosening just enough for Catherine to knock it aside. The weapon discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet ricocheting off stone walls and filling the chamber with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Catherine didn't wait to see where it hit. She turned and ran for the exit tunnel, praying her legs would carry her to safety. Behind her, Donovan was cursing and scrambling for his gun, blood streaming from his wounded wrist. Kelly, he shouted. She's getting away. Cut her off at the north entrance. Catherine plunged into the exit tunnel, following the flow of fresh air toward what she hoped was freedom. The passage was narrow and rough, forcing her to duck in places and squeeze through others. Her dress was torn to ribbons now, and her hands were scraped raw from steadying herself against the stone walls. Light appeared ahead, real sunlight, not the flickering glow of lanterns. Catherine pushed herself faster, driven by hope and desperation. She could hear Donovan behind her, closer now, his boots ringing against stone as he gave chase. She burst out of the mine entrance into the late afternoon sun, momentarily blinded after the darkness below ground. When her vision cleared, she saw rolling hills covered in autumn grass, with the familiar outline of Redemption Falls church steeple visible in the distance. But she also saw Kelly, Donovan's silent partner, waiting beside their horses with a rifle in his hands. He had anticipated her escape route and positioned himself to cut her off. Catherine's heart sank as she realized she had fled from one trap into another. Well, Donovan panted as he emerged from the mine behind her. Looks like you've got nowhere left to run, Mrs. McKenna. Kelly here doesn't talk much, but he's real good at following orders. And my orders are to bring you back to Murphy, one way or another. The sound of galloping horses thundered across the valley like approaching storm clouds, growing louder with each passing second. Catherine looked up from where she stood trapped between Donovan and Kelly, her heart leaping as she recognized the lead rider. James McKenna rode his horse like a man possessed, his face dark with fury and his rifle glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him came Marshal Thompson and 3 deputies, their badges catching the light as they crested the hill. Looks like your husband figured out you were missing after all, Donovan snarled, raising his gun toward the approaching riders. Too bad he's too late to save you. Catherine watched James spur his horse harder, closing the distance between them with reckless speed. Even from 100 yards away, she could see the determination in his posture, the set of his shoulders that meant he would not be stopped. Her heart swelled with love and terror in equal measure, love for the man who had come to save her, terror that he might be riding into his death. James! She screamed, hoping her voice would carry across the distance. It's a trap. They have rifles. Donovan backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling backward. Shut your mouth, or I'll shut it permanently. But Catherine's warning had been heard. The riders spread out as they approached, making themselves harder targets. Marshal Thompson raised his own rifle and fired a shot over Kelly's head, the crack echoing off the hillsides like thunder. Federal Marshal! Thompson's voice boomed across the valley. Drop your weapons and surrender. Kelly, who had remained silent throughout Catherine's captivity, finally spoke. There's too many of them, Donovan. We should run. We're not running anywhere, Donovan replied through gritted teeth. Murphy's paying us to bring her back, and that's what we're going to do. Besides, I've got a score to settle with the blacksmith. James was close enough now that Catherine could see his face clearly, weathered and determined, with eyes that blazed like forge fire. He had his rifle ready but wasn't aiming it yet, probably afraid of hitting her in the confusion. Behind him, the marshal and his men were spreading out in a wide arc, trying to surround Donovan and Kelly. Let her go, Donovan, James called out as he reined in his horse 50 yards away. This is between you and me. She's done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. Donovan laughed bitterly. She owes Murphy $5,000, plus interest. That makes it our business, not yours. She doesn't owe Murphy anything, James replied, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. And even if she did, that debt died with her brother. You have no legal claim on her. Marshal Thompson moved his horse closer, his rifle trained on Kelly. This is your last warning. Drop your weapons and surrender, or we'll drop you where you stand. Catherine could feel the tension building like electricity before a lightning strike. Men on both sides had their fingers on triggers, and she was caught in the middle of what could become a deadly crossfire. She thought about the baby growing inside her, about all the dreams and plans that could die here in this windswept valley. Donovan, she said quietly, you don't have to do this. Murphy is in jail. His power is broken. If you surrender now, they might go easy on you. Easy on me? Donovan's laugh was harsh and bitter. You don't know Murphy like I do. He's got reach that extends far beyond any jail cell. If I don't bring you back, he'll make sure I pay the price. And that's not a debt I'm willing to carry. Kelly shifted nervously, his rifle wavering between James and the marshal. Donovan, maybe we should listen to her. Maybe we should. His words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. But it hadn't come from any of the men surrounding them. Instead, it came from the hillside above, where a fifth rider sat on horseback with a smoking rifle in his hands. Catherine's heart sank as she recognized the newcomer Sean Murphy, the man's nephew, who had apparently been watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Nobody moves. Sean called out, his rifle now trained on James. Uncle Seamus sent me to make sure the job gets done right. The woman comes with us or the blacksmith dies. The standoff had become even more dangerous, with Catherine trapped in the center of a circle of armed men. She could see James calculating angles and distances, probably trying to figure out how to reach her without getting shot. Marshal Thompson was doing the same thing, his experienced eyes taking in the tactical situation. You're making a mistake, boy, Thompson called up to Sean. Your uncle is already facing federal charges. If you shoot a federal marshal, they'll hang you for sure. They'll have to catch me first, Sean replied. And they won't, because I'll be long gone with the woman by the time you figure out what happened. Catherine realized that words weren't going to solve this crisis. The Murphy men were too desperate, too committed to their course of action. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to protect her unborn child and the man she loved, she would have to act. She still had the small medical knife hidden in the folds of her torn dress. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was sharp and she knew how to use it. The trick would be getting close enough to Donovan to make it count. I'll go with you, she said suddenly, taking a step toward Donovan. I'll come quietly if you promise not to hurt anyone else. Catherine, no, James shouted, but she ignored him. I'm tired of running, she continued, moving closer to Donovan with each word. I'm tired of other people getting hurt because of me. If going with you will end this, then that's what I'll do. Donovan's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he lowered his gun slightly. Smart choice. Murphy always said you were clever. Catherine took another step closer, close enough now to smell the whiskey on Donovan's breath and see the cruel satisfaction in his eyes. But first, she said, I need to tell my husband something. Something important. Make it quick, Donovan growled. Catherine turned toward James, her heart breaking at the anguish in his face. James, she called out, her voice carrying across the valley. I need you to know. We're going to have a baby. The words hit him like a physical blow. She could see the shock, then the joy, then the fierce protectiveness that crossed his features in quick succession. It was the reaction she had hoped for, the distraction she needed. As Donovan turned to look at James's reaction, Catherine struck. The medical knife slid between his ribs with surgical precision, finding the spot that would disable without killing. Donovan screamed and dropped his gun, clutching at the wound as he fell to his knees. The rest happened in seconds. Kelly, startled by Donovan's scream, swung his rifle toward Catherine. James spurred his horse forward, covering the distance in a few powerful strides. Marshal Thompson's rifle cracked, and Kelly pitched backward off his horse. Sean fired from the hillside, but his shot went wide as James reached Catherine and swept her up onto his horse. The marshal's men returned fire, and Sean's horse reared and bolted, carrying him away across the hills with bullets whistling around his head. As the dust settled, Catherine found herself safe in James's arms, her face pressed against his chest as he held her tight enough to crush her ribs. It's over, he whispered into her hair. It's finally over. Marshal Thompson dismounted and checked on Donovan, who was still alive but badly wounded. He'll live, the marshal announced. Kelly's dead, and the nephew got away, but I doubt we'll see him again. Word will get back to Murphy that his plan failed. James helped Catherine down from his horse, his hands gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. A baby, he said wonderingly, placing his palm against her still flat stomach. We're really going to have a baby? Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. I was going to tell you tonight over dinner. I had it all planned out. James laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the valley. Well, This is certainly more memorable than dinner conversation. As they rode back to Redemption Falls together, Catherine reflected on how much her life had changed. She had come west as a desperate woman with no choices, and she was returning home as a wife, a mother-to-be, and a valued member of her community. The threat of Murphy still existed somewhere in the distance, but it no longer had the power to terrorize her. She had found her strength, chosen her battles, and discovered that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come disguised as the greatest challenges. In James's arms, with their child growing beneath her heart and their future stretching bright before them, Catherine McKenna finally understood what it meant to be truly home. The sun was setting over the Wyoming Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And for the first time in her life, Catherine Walsh McKenna was exactly where she belonged.